Thank you.
Hey everyone, welcome to another English grammar lesson. Today we're going to be continuing our study of quotation marks in dialogue.
Welcome to English 3E. This is week 5, and we are on unit 3. And this is Jillian Percy talking.
Okay, so last time we looked at how to
Oh,
write lines
I
of dialogue
apologize.
with the speaker tag at the beginning.
That shouldn't have come up. All right. These are the ways to reach me at the studio, 1-800-465-7144. At the WASA office, 1-800-667-3703. Unfortunately, right now, you still can't leave messages for me. It's still queued to the previous teacher, and I don't know the password. I apologize. 1-800-463-7852 is the fax number. You can fax any work you want to fax to me. If you're trying to reach me, one of the best ways really is the email, because I check that pretty regularly. Jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. YouTube, capital G, capital P, ERCY, space, capital W, AHSE, SA, sorry. All right, so this is the unit we're working on, the one called The Journey. This is unit 3. We should be working on that this week and next week and maybe a little bit the week after, we'll see. Okay, so verb tenses. We touched briefly before on the topic of verb tenses, but I wanted to come back to it because there really is a lot to know about verb tenses in English. We've already covered that in English, verb tenses can be singular or plural, and we've learned that verbs must have a base or a root form. Singular nouns must have a singular verb, and plural nouns must have a plural verb. Plural verbs, however, do not end in S like nouns do. We only add S to the verb when the noun or pronoun is singular and in the third person. Third person is he, she, or it. So for example, he runs to the store. Some languages have a masculine and feminine noun and verb forms, but English does not. Some languages also indicate animate or inanimate noun and verb forms, but English does not have that either. So verb tense, and then there's aspect, and then there's mood. So we use verb tenses to indicate if an action happened in the past, in the present, or the future. And then we use verb aspect to show the flow of time, whether an action took place in a single block of time, or if the action was continuous or repeated. And third, we use verb mood to show the attitude of the action. Is the verb actually happening? Is it possibly happening? Or is it being commanded to happen? So let's go into each of these with a little more detail. To start, I wanted to talk about the present participle. Present participle is just the root verb plus the ing ending, because they refer to it a lot as we're talking about this, and I wanted to make sure people knew what it meant. It generally shows continuous action. Now, that action can be happening in the present, the past, or the future. Some examples are walking, running, wishing, drawing, dreaming, imagining, believing, or creating. So there are 4 tenses for each of the present, past, and future. So simple present tense shows actions happening in the present. It's often just the root form of the verb, like I wash the dishes. Now, of course, that could still be singular or plural, right? Perfect present tense is used in a lot of different ways. Basically, you add has or have to the past participle, which we haven't really talked about yet, but we will. An ongoing action that started in the past but isn't done yet. So she has grown so much. Or the same action repeated in the past and likely to be done again. She has won the race every year. An action completed very recently, often used with just or now. For example, she has just graduated. An uncompleted action that is expected to be finished in the negative. So she has not finished her project yet. Then we have the present continuous tense. That shows that an action is happening right now. For this one, we use am or is or are, right? Plus the present participle. We are reading Charlotte's Web at school. I am walking to the store. And then we have present perfect continuous. So it's kind of these two combined here. Have been or has been plus the present participle, an ongoing action that started in the past. And we use it to show the length of time. So, like, we have been practicing for the concert all month. All right. Then, okay. Is there? Oh, right. This one has choices here. Sorry. Look, Thomas is bringing or brings his little sister to class. I think it depends on what they meant, right? If he's bringing it sounds like look like it's happening right now, though, in which case it would be is bringing. My older sister is often listening to pop music or often listens to pop music. Generally, we would say often listens. Okay. You could do is often listening, though, because of it being continuous. We something an exercise now. We are writing or we write. I would say generally we are writing. We're doing it right now, but it's continuous. Mom is making a cake or mom makes a cake. The would imply it's happening right now. So I would go with is making. Our teacher is giving us a test every month or gives us a test every month. It's happening repeatedly. I would kind of go with that. Listen, Dad is reading or reads a story to Ricky. Is reading because it's happening right now. Mr. Michael usually is growing or grows roses in his garden. I'm going to say grows, and I'm going to go back here and fix this and say I think gives. Okay. So you can see there is some question. It depends a little bit. You can see like they both sound okay. It depends a little bit on what you're meaning, right? They are building a new house on the hill right now. So they're doing it right now and it's continuous. Okay. Maria something milk each morning. Is drinking milk each morning or drinks? I just say she drinks. Look, Nick something down the hill. Nick is running or runs? I would say he's doing it right now. Mary is listening to music now or listens? I would say is listening because it's kind of an ongoing action. Tom usually drinks coffee, but he is drinking tea right now. We are going to the disco. The disco. Wow. Okay. The disco tonight. Is he going to work by bus every day or does he go? I would say, does he go? Do the children play or are the children playing? I would say, are the children playing outside right now? Because they're asking about the now part. Okay. So that would be an example of present tense. The past participle, which we talked about really briefly, it's the simple past tense, which is just like with the regular verb, you add the ed. It can also be the past tense of an irregular verb that doesn't have the ed ending. So walked, liked, smelled, tasted, dreamed, cooked, chopped, parked. For irregular verbs, here's some examples: felt, lost, slept, bit, broken, bought, caught, done. The past tense, and again, there's four. There's the simple, there's the past perfect, past continuous, and past perfect continuous. Sometimes they call that progressive, so just in case you've heard it that way. So the simple past tense just shows actions that are completed in the past, and you simply add the ed to a regular verb. This is the part we call the past participle. We use it again later on. Irregular verbs also can have different ways to show past tense. It's not always ed. And again, this happens in part because we borrow so many of our words from other languages. Okay, past perfect tense. Use when an action happened in the past as a single event. And generally, when you're talking about two different past actions and you add had to the past participle to show that that verb occurred before the other one. So, for example, she had eaten the egg before she realized it was mine. The had eaten part shows you that that happened first. Okay. Past continuous tense shows an action that was ongoing in the past but is not occurring now. So we add was or were to the present participle. The baby was crying last night, and it's implied that the baby's no longer crying, right? I was driving all day, but now I'm not, right? Past perfect continuous tense. This one describes ongoing actions in the past rather than one-time occurrences. For those, we add had been to the present participle. So, for example, I had been training for the race all year until I was injured. Okay. So it was going on. And then often there's like a time one for that as well, because the continuous, right? Continuous is always kind of talking about time. So here's like a little mini one. Let me see if I can pull up. You know what? I'm going to go to the board really quick for this because I'll be easier, I think. We've got number one, and I didn't include the whole task. There just wasn't room for it to be able to be visible. She never something to eat soup. She never didn't like to eat soup. No, that doesn't make any sense. She never liked to eat soup. Nope. She never had liked to eat soup. She never would not like to eat soup. She liked. I would just go with liked. Oops. Oh, hang on. Is it going to let me do that? Oh, it doesn't want me to let me do that. Hang on a second. Well, let me. Nope, it just doesn't want to do it. The moment I'm grabbing it, it's trying to get away from me. Meh. No, I apologize. Okay, well, I would go with E there. I'm so sorry that it won't let me do that. Let me see if I can type it really quick. Hang on a second. It was working yesterday. I don't know why it's not working today. Okay, hang on. Okay. So for that one, I would just say E. Okay. I'll drink tea from this tin mug. Where something, you something, it. So I'm going to go with where did you find it? Or where do you find it? Do would be happening right now. No. Where did you found it? Where were you found it? No. Where are you found it? For this one, the very first one was kind of it all along, and you could tell it just kind of sounds right, right? Where are you? No, where did you find it? Where did you find it? Okay. Number three, it was dark and cold. At one moment, he thought that he lost his way, will lose his way, had lost, was lost, or loses. So he thought that I'm not going to say lost because they're talking about he did think it, but no longer, right? So will lose. No, that's the future. He had lost. Yeah, he had lost for sure. So that would be C. Okay. A policeman something me crossing the street yesterday. A policeman seen me crossing the street yesterday. That is past tense, but we wouldn't use it without a helper verb. A policeman saw me crossing the street yesterday. Yeah, could use that. A policeman has seen me crossing the street yesterday. No, because that's talking about the present tense, but yesterday means it's a past tense. Will see. Nope, that's the future. A policeman had seen. So for that one, I would again go with the E, had seen. Why is it not letting me do that? There we go. So again, just an E. Okay. Arthur something all his exams by 5 o'clock yesterday. All right. So it was done yesterday. So it's the past. And they're mentioning a time. So it's going to be not just a simple past, it's going to have to be one of the other type of pasts, right? So Arthur passed all his exams by 5 o'clock yesterday. Passes, no, because passes is current. Has passed, nope. has been passed, had passed. Back to E again. He's our favorite so far. Oh, sorry, it's not letting me grab the text box there. E. He evidently something his shoes for a very long time. They were worn out. So were wearing, no, because that's happening right now, and that isn't what it was doing. Are wearing, same thing. No, it's not current. He had been wearing. Yes, because that's talking about something that was continuous and now has changed. So C. Okay. All right. Going on to future tense. Again, 4 tenses. There's simple future, future perfect, future continuous, future perfect continuous. Okay. And don't worry, most people don't know the names of these, especially we kind of got away from teaching grammar in the school, but it really is a bit it's one of those funny things that you get used to how it sounds. But if you're coming from a language that uses verbs a little bit differently, that might not happen. So I'm kind of teaching it specifically, hoping that will help. We'll see. Simple future is talking about actions that haven't happened yet, but will later. And it's just very simple. So for that one, we just add the word will and then the root verb. So she will go to the store tomorrow. Future perfect tense, it's going to be completed in the future by a specified time. Okay. So for that one, we add will have and then the past participle because it's going to get completed. So we're talking about it as if it's already done in a sense. She will have eaten lunch by the time I get home. I will have done the dishes before you come over. So it's happening in the future, but they're talking about like when it's going to be done at. Future continuous, things that are going to happen in the future, but over a period of time, and they will often specify the time. For that, we're going to use will be plus the present participle. We will be watching the movie tomorrow night. Jack will be running the race next week. So it has a continuous type of action. And then future perfect continuous tense. This is used for future ongoing actions that are going to continue up to a specific point. And then these ones are also used with a specific time. So will have been plus the present participle. So next month, I will have been losing weight all year. By tomorrow, I will have been traveling for a week. Okay. So we're looking ahead and using that time ahead as kind of a marker for a continuous action that's been going on for a while. All right. And we're just going to talk this one through because last time it didn't work very well for me to try and grab it. I apologize. So the example is, it's late. I something now. I will go. I am going to go, or I am going. I am going now. Irene something to the theater tonight. She's got a free ticket. So she will go to the theater tonight. She is going to the theater tonight, or she is going to go. I would just say will go. That seems fine. We something if we can find a ticket for the REM concert, said Irene. We will see, are seeing, see. Will see, because it's talking about the future, right? If we can find a ticket. Are seeing would be happening right now, doesn't work there. There are black clouds in the sky. It is going to rain. It will rain. It is raining. And again, it's talking about will rain because it's the future. It's not happening yet, is would imply it's happening right now. Tomorrow, it something sunny with some rain. It will be sunny, or is going to be, or is being. And again, you got the will, it's happening tomorrow. It's going to have the future tense there. I'm sorry I something here tomorrow. Ooh, got negatives here, which we haven't really talked about. I'll tackle that on Monday. I wilt be. I won't be. I am not going to be. I would say I am not going to be, right? Because it's talking about a future action. Oh, well. Nope. Future is, I'm going to have to use won't. Can't be am because am is happening right now. Will is the positive form of won't. Won't is like the abbreviation for will not. Ooh, that's a tricky one. Okay. All right. Okay. So this is what we've been working on all week. Monday we did Shemaiah. Tuesday we worked on Alone on the Ocean. Yesterday we worked on the Borderline Jeans ad and the advertising. And then today we're talking about how to identify bias. And then we kind of went ahead and looked at assignment 11 yesterday, but you may not be finished and that'll work for today too. That's for next week. Here is this week's. So, how to identify bias? A bias is an opinion or a preference. The word bias often seems kind of negative, but everybody has some sort of bias, even though we aren't always aware of it. Bias can keep us from making objective judgments. People who make media content use things like lighting, sound, and camera angles to give us their message from their point of view or whatever view they want to sell. The choices they make can reflect messages about what to expect of people based on money, looks, age, cultural background, social class, and gender. As a viewer, you need to be aware of these types of bias and make your own decisions about the types of values and beliefs being shared. So, some things to think about. Have you ever been pleased with or angered by a message you noticed in a commercial or TV program? And then why? So, here on the left is a magazine ad that angered a lot of people. If you can see the ad there, it's a Reebok ad, and their tagline is "Cheat on your girlfriend, not on your workout." So, wow, that's nice. 2012. Nike isn't the only sportswear company that's used distasteful ads. Reebok had all the pain and no gain when they put up these posters in Germany. A rep from Reebok went on NPR to apologize and made it clear that the company does not condone cheating in any way. You have to wonder what they were thinking when they originally gave the green light on this horrible ad copy. See, I find myself wondering, is this a case where there were no girls in the room going, hey, that's really rude? Was it just a bunch of guys going, hey, that's really funny? All right. Number 2, how could knowing about bias in the media help you in the workplace? So this one is a study of 1,000 parents of primary school age children and 1,000 UK-based children aged 5 to 11 showed that bias is embedded at a young age. 45% of the children polled believe that nurses are always women, while 22% said a doctor is likely to be a man. It's kind of nice that one isn't as high. In addition, 60% of the kids think that being a plumber or electrician is a man's job, and almost half of the boys and girls surveyed said that men always make better engineers. So a group of companies kind of got together and are trying to challenge this bias. Imagine a CEO. Is it a man? Imagine a feminist. Is it a woman? Imagine somebody crying in the office. Is that a woman? Imagine somebody in a board meeting. Is it a man? Imagine somebody's leaving early to pick up their kids. Is it a woman? Imagine a nurse. Is it a woman? I actually have kind of a similar story for this. I used to work at a pizza place, and they had kind of a rule that in order to go on and be manager, you had to have done every job in the place. But they hadn't stopped to think about the fact that that kind of discriminated against the women, because there's one job that the women almost never did in the place because required a lot of arm strength. There was a dishwashing job, and you had to carry these huge trays of like glasses and dishes. So mostly it was young boys hiring. So when there was a girl who had done a lot of the jobs and wanted to try and become a manager, but because she hadn't done every job, they initially weren't willing to consider her. And she had to point out, well, yeah, but if you say that, then you're basically saying we're never going to hire women as managers because the women never end up doing that job. And when they had that pointed out to them, they stopped and thought about it and decided to go ahead and give her a chance at trying to be a manager at the store. But before that, they just hadn't stopped to think about the fact that there was a gender bias in that particular restriction at workplace. So knowing about workplace biases helped her to get them to change their mind and get a better job. Think about, how do you think the information we get on the news would be affected if the government controlled our newscasts or all of our information sources? Like, there are some countries, for example, that they don't have free internet access. So you can go on and see almost anything, but if you live in certain places where there's communist governments, often they restrict severely what their citizens are able to see. So they don't even know that there's other opinions or different issues happening. So during the revolution in China, which was called the Great Leap Forward, the chant, "People's communes are good," became very popular. This was in 1958. Here's kind of a picture there showing a very happy commune. Propaganda posters showed people's communes where everyone happily lived and worked together and where harvests were abundant. Thing is, this wasn't actually true. The policies that they made and poor weather conditions contributed to the Great Chinese Famine, in which millions died. But that wasn't being admitted at the time. So then, as always, there's a do-it-yourself part where they're talking about understanding different types of bias, okay? So one type of bias is called bias by omission. And that's when you define a group or an event, right, without including all the information about it. And basically, it's left out deliberately. And if you'd included it, it might have changed people's minds about the story or the event. So here's an example of media bias by omission. The CNN had previously reported on the FBI's hate crime statistics, which had been released in last November, which showed that the number of hate crimes reported to the FBI Bureau rose about 17% in 2017 compared to 2016. 2017 was the latest year for which those statistics are available. And then they announced, oh, it's the third straight year that hate crime incidents have rose. However, they didn't give you all the information. In a piece titled, okay, let's talk about that. However, according to the FBI's website, reports of hate crime incidents did rise from previous years, but so did the number of agencies reporting. In other words, they had more businesses reporting hate crimes, not necessarily because there was more hate crimes occurring, but in the idea of they had included more businesses in the program. So now there were approximately 1,000 more agencies contributing information. So that makes it kind of unclear. Are hate crimes actually on the rise, as the headline claims? Or does it just appear that because more agencies are reporting, so then of course you're going to have more hate crimes? Don't know for sure because they deliberately reported it in a biased manner. Biased by commission. This is drawing attention to particular qualities to define or separate a person or group of people. And I don't know if this is the exact one. I was trying to have kind of having a hard time trying to think about how to do this. I would say the thing with bias by commission is they're deliberately pointing out one part of a situation or people, and they're deliberately leaving off other parts. Okay. So they may be really focusing on the positive and leaving off the negative, or they may be really focusing on the negative and leaving off the positive. So this is an examination was done of the newspapers in Texas and how they reported on different protests and what kind of words they used depending on what the protest was about. So if they used the word riot, they were tending to emphasize disruptive behavior and the use or the threat of violence. If they used the word confrontation, This is when they were often describing protests as combative. They focused on the number of arrests or clashes with the police. If they were using spectacle, they were focusing on the apparel, signs, and dramatic or emotional behavior of protesters. You know how sometimes protesters lately have gone to like wearing very unusual costumes or headgear or very different kind of signs trying to attract attention. Or if they used the word debate, in that case, they were really giving a lot of weight to what the protesters' demands or agendas or goals were. Whereas in these other ones, they weren't necessarily talking about what the protesters wanted or really considering whether what they wanted was valid, I guess. So down here is like a little graph of things. Texas papers were more likely to write positively about the aims of protests that were related to health and immigration compared to those about racism, sorry. So anti-Black racism, they used riot language 43% of the time, confrontation language 25% of the time, spectacle language 55% of the time, and legitimizing only 22% of the time. Anti-Trump coverage, riot was only used 20% of the time. Confrontation was used 30% of the time. Spectacle was used 61% of the time, which is pretty high. And then 43% of the time they used legitimizing coverage. International protests. Riot was used only 17% of the time. Confrontation 23% of the time. Spectacle 69% of the time. And then legitimizing 29% of the time. The Dakota pipeline. 12% of the time they were talking about things in riot terms, 75% of the time confrontation terms, 75% of the time spectacle, and only 15% of the time were they talking about it in a legitimizing way. Immigration, riot only used 9% of the time, which is pretty good actually. Confrontation, 19% of the time. Spectacle, 70% of the time. And then legitimizing 52% of the time, which is actually really quite good. Gender, riots were discussed only 4% of the time. Confrontation, only 3% of the time. Spectacle, 59% of the time, so pretty high for that. But legitimizing was 44% of the time too, so that's kind of good. The NFL, the National Football League. Oh, okay, I know what protests they're talking about. I was like, what protests are happening? Okay. 1% of the time riot, 0% of the time confrontation, 71% of the time spectacle, 25% of the time legitimizing. Now, I just want to point out something that they aren't mentioning is not all of these involved the same number of, say, incidents with like police and stuff like the National Football League. I don't think there was anything involving the police. I could be wrong. I didn't follow that super closely. So it's unlikely that they would have mentioned riot or confrontations. They aren't mentioning that part either, right? It'd be interesting if they compared it to like the number of police that were at the protests or the number of arrests made or things like that. Health and environment. Riot was mentioned 0% of the time. Confrontation, 19%. Spectacle, 75% of the time. And then legitimizing 56% of the time. Okay. And then local news, riot was mentioned 0%. Confrontation, 7%. Spectacle, 59%. And 41% for legitimizing. So if you look at this, you can see like spectacle is consistently the highest one. So in other words, they're covering the protest depending on how eye-catching in a sense that it is, rather than how legitimate the arguments are, which is a shame. This is an example of this. How the media covered the Capitol insurrection in the States. Last Wednesday, journalists started the day using the term protest or rally. Now, this is obviously talking about the U.S. protest that turned into the the insurrection on the Capitol in the States. So it's not last Wednesday anymore. It's much longer than that. This fits the typical pattern. Conservative actions are often termed a rally rather than a protest, which is another subtle form of legitimization. But then the coverage pivoted to insurrection and siege. The perpetrators were no longer protesters, but rioters and part of a mob. News media also covered the insurrection using the spectacle frame. But for this particular far-right protest, that frame could be construed as delegitimizing. Seeing a man dressed in a horned hat with his face painted contributed to an almost carnivalesque sense of disbelief and even a mockery of the rioters. Of course, we still need more systematic analysis of news coverage of the insurrection and comparisons with, for example, the coverage of 2020's Black Lives Matter protests. But early signs suggest that coverage of the violence at the US Capitol might not implicitly legitimize the event as much as coverage of previous conservative protests have done. What this means going forward. With outlets like the Kansas City Star apologizing for racist coverage of Black communities and civil rights protests and promising to do better, the news coverage of protests could change. So I don't know if you remember the time, but there was a lot of discussion at the time that how the insurrection was being covered was completely different than how the media covered the Black Lives Matters protests. This is kind of looking at that and saying, yeah, it kind of started that way, but it did change, with the idea that maybe that would change in the future. So I don't know if anyone's done a study yet to see if it did happen or not. Implicit bias. Implicit bias is when you're presenting material from a narrow perspective or using stereotypes. So I'm going to come back to this for a second, because what I was talking about was coverage of the Oka crisis. Let me see if this will read me here. Okay. How the media framed the Oka crisis as terrorism. Now, if you're on the younger side, you may not remember this. In 1990, there was a protest over the fact that the city of Oka was trying to take over some lands that were Mohawk lands, and they wanted to extend a golf course, basically. And their indigenous people that lived there were protesting, and it was portrayed extremely negatively, which this is kind of what they were talking about. It says, because the media can frame public events, it has played a large role in shaping how people think of indigenous peoples' fight for sovereignty and the integrity of their land. The movie Beans, which will have a limited release starting November 5th, that was about 2 years ago, offers an Indigenous perspective on what many Canadians know as the Oka crisis. In doing so, it reframes a historical narrative that's been dominated by settler interpretations. So in March 1989, a group of settlers announced plans to create a golf course on the ancestral land of the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk people, in what is now known as Quebec. For more than 2.5 months during the summer of 1990, activists and other Indigenous allies led a blockade against the Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It started off much smaller. It didn't start off that big. By the end of the crisis, the plans to build the golf course were canceled. By amplifying the rhetoric of anti-terrorism in mass media, journalists fed into stereotypes of Indigenous people as being dangerous. Beans is a semi-autobiographical film based on the experiences of a Kanien'kehá:ka filmmaker, Tracy Deer, who was a teenager during the Oka crisis. In a 2012 analysis of the events, Indigenous studies scholar Pauline Wakeham argued that the Canadian media and government at the time portrayed the Kanien'kehá:ka as terrorists. Due to the temporal coincidence of Desert Storm happening in the Middle East and the standoff with Canadian forces, settler leaders such as Quebecois separatist Jacques Parizeau was able to transpose the scene of purported Iraqi lawlessness onto the scene of Kanan Kahaka protest. By amplifying the rhetoric of anti-terrorism in mass media, Wakeham elaborated journalists fed into stereotypes of Indigenous people as dangerous and thereby ignored the cause of activists. Okay, I'm going to pause and go back here. I was doing a bunch of reading on this because it was kind of interesting. So presenting material from a narrow perspective or using stereotypes. So if you remember the crisis or if you read up on the crisis, at the time, it was really portrayed in the media as being like an illegitimate protest because the courts had denied the land claim that the Mohawks had put forward in the courts. So they were like, well, the land claim was denied, so therefore it's illegitimate. And so therefore this qualifies as terrorism. So there was a narrow perspective and they didn't provide all the information. So there was implicit bias and there was also bias by omission, which is really common. Like it's unlikely they're going to use only one type. I want to point this out. This is from, oh no, wait, hang on. From the Wikipedia, it talks about how in 1868, 1 year after Confederation, the chief of the Oka Mohawk people, Joseph Anasakenrat, wrote a letter to the seminary there claiming that its grant had included about 23 kilometers square reserved for Mohawk use that was in the trust of the seminary. And the seminary had neglected this trust by granting themselves sole ownership rights instead. In 1869, Anna Sekenrat attacked the seminary with a small armed force after having given the missionaries 8 days to hand over the land. Local authorities ended the standoff with force. In 1936, the seminary sold the territory under protest by the local Mohawk community. At the time, they still kept cattle on the common land. By 1956, the Mohawk were left to 6 remaining square kilometers from their original 165. So that's the part that really did not get mentioned in like the mainstream media at the time, was that going back several hundred years, they had been given a certain amount of land and bits and pieces had been given away over the years. And so when this last bit came up, it was just like the last straw, right? But that part was really not discussed much in the main media. In March 1989, the Golf Club Doka, sorry, the Golf de, Club de Golf Doke, I'm not saying that right, it's French, sorry, announced plans to expand the golf course by an additional 9 holes. As the Office of Native Claims had rejected the Mohawk claim on the land three years earlier, the office did not consult the Mohawk on the plans. No environmental or historic preservation review was undertaken. Protests by Mohawks and others, as well as concern from the Quebec Minister of the Environment, led to negotiation and a postponement of their project by the municipality in August, pending a court ruling on the development's legality. However, on June 30th, 1990, the court found in favor of the developers, and the mayor of Oka, Jean Ouellette, announced that the remainder of the pines would be cleared to expand the golf course to 18 holes and to construct 60 condominiums. Not all residents of Oka approved of the plans, but opponents found the mayor's office was unwilling to discuss them. The thing they also kind of didn't mention was that there was burial grounds of the Mohawk people there. So this is what we're talking about, where how the media covered that particular event, which lasted for over 2 months, really shaped how people thought of First Nations people, because they had left off a lot of information. And there was a deliberate portraying of the situation in a very warlike manner, even though the initial protest did not start off in a warlike manner at all. Gosh, if we don't finish everything today, we'll get back. See if I can get back to this. Hang on a second. Okay, so this is kind of a timeline. If you get a chance to look at this is kind of really interesting because they include different newscasts that were happening at the time. So you can kind of see what was being said at the time rather than 30 years later, sometimes people kind of revise what they said. And you can see a little bit of the actual initial casts. So for example, look how this is perfectly peaceful. Are you aware that this is Mohawk territory? Nothing threatening about that. They're just kind of like trying to like get people to kind of think about this, right? But here you've got the headline is Warriors in the Pines, right? Yeah, it's really, really interesting if you follow through all the different statements and stuff. There's a spot at which people tried to leave and they weren't allowed to leave, which is kind of interesting because everything was being blamed on the First Nations people, even though at some point the First Nations people, or at least some of them, were trying to end things by going away. So worth looking at. We're kind of running short on time, so I won't have much time to go into that. Explicit bias. That's presenting a prejudiced view of events, individuals, or groups. These are, again, really similar, okay? The narrow perspective and the using stereotypes pretty much go along with prejudiced views of events, individuals, or groups. So, for example, again, we're talking about media here, Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory is really, it's a very funny show, but it's always kind of told from the point of view of the men, right? So the girls are kind of always portrayed as sex objects, more or less, right? And everything is viewed by how it affects the guys rather than how it's affecting the girls. So this article was kind of basically talking about some of the ongoing issues with that particular show. Let me see here. Okay, so all that was talking about the different types of bias that you can see in media, and there's a whole lot more, which if we have a chance, we'll talk about a little bit more. And they're talking about trying to do this yourself. This is talking about take a news show to view. Step 3 covers other types of media. As you watch, take notes to answer the questions below. What are the top stories, right? Because they always put like the most important stories first, usually. What do you think of the order in which they're represented? Does each story qualify as news, in your opinion, and explain? Are there words and pictures on the screen, and how do they change what you understand the news story? Who is reading the news, and how does that affect what you think of the news? How do the anchors speak? Think about their tone and how they deliver the information. How do the anchors' word choices affect the information they give? Does the anchor give the information in a straightforward way? So now this isn't an actual assignment. This is just us talking about how you would look for bias, because you don't have to do this. It's just an example of how you can do it. So for example, with the Oka crisis, right? Some newscasters were referring to people as terrorists. Well, that's going to affect how people think of the people involved, right? Let me see here. This, okay. This isn't actually a TV show. This was...
The team we support most fiercely is Family. With Remitly's great rates and low fees, more money makes it home. Download the app.
Listen, there's a good chance somebody...
Okay, I'm going to end that right there. Basically, it was an article talking about how in the news, when they were talking about the Ukraine crisis, they were always showing pictures of white people, even though there's actually people of all sorts of colors over in Ukraine, but they were never being included in the news clips. And they were basically pointing out the racism in that, and that people seemed far more concerned about the issue happening to Ukraine than they had over similar types of issues in countries that were not predominantly white. So the media article is looking at how who they included in their pictures affects how people think of what's going on, plus the stories that they don't cover. That's kind of, I was trying to think of ways to show that. That's kind of hard to show, right? There's been so much coverage of the Ukraine war, which is horrible, and I have complete sympathy. But what they're pointing out is there wasn't as much coverage of many similar types of attacks when it wasn't countries that were so prominently white. And why is that? Why were those stories not considered important, but these stories are? Why, when they're choosing clips, are they only choosing clips of white people and not choosing clips of people of other colors? So even just in a matter of who they're choosing, if you're not there, you don't know who's actually there. You don't realize that the pictures are being chosen to portray a certain look or image. We'll kind of talk about that later on because there's a really interesting list of all the different ways that the media can manipulate how they present the information to affect what you think of the information. And often we're just completely unaware that that's even happening. So we ran a little bit short on time. We will tackle some of that other stuff tomorrow. Or no, sorry, not tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday. We'll tackle some of that other stuff on Monday. There is no assignments today. Today was just kind of a teaching day in terms of talking about bias in the media. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful long weekend. And we will talk again on Tuesday, actually. Okay. All right. Take care.